in being an artist as well, when you get to actually talk to other artists and get to see what they're about. I'd like to introduce Ronald Muchatuta. He is our visiting artist for today. Some of our content that we delivered in the lecture series revolved around his work, and we're very fortunate enough to have him here today to speak to the subject of diasporic subjectivities and how he engages with it in his work. I've known Ronald for quite a while. We have common histories, I suppose, both being Zimbabwean and living in South Africa. And yeah, well, I think we will run the presentation as such that we have a few things to show you, 2 short videos, and then we'll go into talking about work, whereupon Ronald and I will engage in a discussion and then open it up for conversation. In the background, we've got Rachel Collette, who is the coordinator of the Visual Studies course, who is going to be a moderator, and also watching for any interesting questions that you might have in the chat, or if you raise your hand, please do feel free to raise your hand if you want to ask a question, and you don't have to wait right up until the end, unless you are pressed to do so. Okay. I might just ask if everyone could just mute their microphones if they're not speaking. And yeah, I think we'll take it away from here. So for those of us who are not from the Visual Arts Department, I am Professor Vulindela Nyoni, and I'm the HOD for the Visual Arts on Nelson Mandela University. I'm also a printmaker and an artist myself. And yes, I think that's basically really it. My area of interest really is diasporic subjectivities. This is the subject of a PhD that I'm doing. And this is also very, very exciting for me to hear from another person's perspective who's working with the same sort of subject matter. So, Rachel, do you have a bio for Ronald?
Yes, I can give a bit of introduction.
Thank you.
So let me share my camera with you, my face. So Ronald Muchatuta is an artist who's currently based in Cape Town, and his work has been represented in many international and local connections. He's recently been chosen to represent Zimbabwe at the Venice Biennale, which is an amazing accomplishment, which brings complexities of its own, as he'll be discussing. His work spans a lot of different mediums, which I find really interesting. It ranges from drawing and painting to installation and collage. And what I'd like to highlight about Ronald's work is that it is the kind of work that makes artists want to make work. You know, there's a level of commitment and dedication to art making here, to practice, to like learning in the studio, that I think is really worth learning from. So yeah, I'd like to hand over back to Prof.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Apart from that, Ronald has a very interesting background in terms of music. I think he'll talk a little bit to that as well. There are, I will get into the way of talking eventually, but so the introduction to the topic that we are delving with or dealing with is really about diasporic subjectivities, and of interest to us is really the creative expressions of diasporic subjectivities. How are people who are in the arts manifesting their experiences as people who would have come from other countries and are now residing in South Africa? I think the common knowledge of diaspora, or common sense of diaspora, is that it is basically about people being spread across the world. And this is true historically, particularly when you think about the Jewish diaspora and the movement of individuals across the globe from their various countries due to violence or immigration and so forth. The point of focus at this point is what transcontinental diaspora or movement really entails, particularly on the continent of Africa. And our interest, of course, is the fraught history of that border crossing between Zimbabwe and South Africa, obviously with the historical events of xenophobic attacks and so forth. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Ronald, and he can perhaps bring us into the first clip. I'm just going to start sharing the PowerPoint. Ronald, I'd like to hand over to you, and maybe you can talk us through maybe some of the history. Maybe give us a little bit of a background from yourself, from your side.
Yeah, so thank you very much, guys, for the platform. I really appreciate it. I hope my audio is all right. I hope I sound good.
Yeah, I think you're fine.
Cool. So I'm a visual artist who has been practicing in South Africa for the past, I think 16 to 17 years. Originally, I'm from Harare. That's where I got my mentorship through a gallery called Gallery Delta, and I did my my visual art studies exams through them, and also in collaboration with the National Gallery. My journey is a little bit different from a lot of artists because I started very young. I started my journey of the visual arts when I was 16. I used to work for a ceramic company, and after that, um, I started a mentorship program at Gallery Delta around 2002, and then in 2006, 2007, I decided to come to South Africa to explore what kind of the art ecosystem here has. So I've been practicing for quite some time here. Besides my visual art studies in Zimbabwe, I also studied architectural mosaic, um, which is a 3-year course on learning the fundamentals of mosaic as a medium. I've been at some of the reputable studio spaces in the country. I've had a studio at Great Mo Studios. I had a studio at the Castle of Good Hope, and also I've done some affiliations and exhibitions with Bag Factory in Johannesburg. I've done some solo shows with the Melrose Gallery, and also done a lot of talks just like this, mentorship programs, a lot of exhibitions, group shows, and stuff. So my work, as we go through this presentation, my work focuses mainly on issues to do with migration. I think it's a content, a subject that I chose to dwell on based on realizing the realities and the imminent experiences that one goes through in their foreign country. So I most of my work tends to zoom in and zoom out with regards to these topics, but it mainly centers my thoughts on how I try to understand my surrounding, also the continent and the wider globe in perspective. So so I think the first video we have to play is my interview on BBC. I was featured as an artist on BBC in 2016, and it kind of like explains the whole thing from my journey to that point. So I think
Sure.
I think, yeah, if you can play that, it'll be.
Okay, great. We'll go to that.
Ten years ago, artist Ronald Muchatuta left Zimbabwe for South Africa to pursue his career in art. His work on African migration, which has a particular focus on xenophobia in South Africa, has received a lot of attention, and it's led to him being able to exhibit his work in galleries around the world. He's been speaking to the BBC about the growing interest in African art, but also about the challenges of working as an independent artist.
2011, just after the xenophobic attacks happened, I decided to make an artwork that was based on how an astronaut would go into space and sort of like try and navigate through space, but from a very foreign, African foreign, perspective. When I finished the painting, I started exploring more with the aesthetic quality of the patterns on the made in China bags that are very accessible in Africa, that are used by people to migrate and stuff like that. I started making work about the necklace and referencing on the third wave of the xenophobic attacks that had happened. Most of the stories I started going into were more about people dying, foreign nationals dying all the time. I was referencing death a lot, tried to put it at ease. As an independent artist, if you are backed by an institution, your value of your work escalates quicker than being independent. And not saying that independent artists who are out there, their value of their work is minimum, but I think that when an artist is represented, the institution or the branding of the institution that represents them boosts the value of their work. There's a huge investment in the magic of Africa. And when I say magic, I'm saying that not the grotesque stories, but the inspiring stories, the beautiful stories, the stories that are not perpetuated and blown out of proportion in terms of how ill-minded and how savage Africans are, but just how inspiring and innovating and how beautiful Africa and Africans are.
Thank you. Shall I move to the next one for?
Yes, yeah.
Oops, there we go.
I think that the picture needed to be painted differently. The picture for the past 5 to 10 years has always been about the work, but I think a lot of people do not understand what transpired for the work to become what it is. The work I make is just another message for the next generation to pick up from and understand what was going on then and how it will reflect the future. I think the most scariest thing for a creative or an artist is when you're making work and no one is noticing. With Latifa, I think I owe a lot to her. She was a good Samaritan.
I just saw these brave boys that took up this journey coming all the way from Zimbabwe as an artist. I still see that bravery within him. And to take up your passion to become your career, it's a big step.
I went to the extra mile, refining my identity as an artist, getting to see the art world in that town, having a full circle moment where the place where I started at is also the place that finds me back, having work and exhibiting with the spaces and the people. This is confirmation that people are noticing. I am Ronald Muchatuta. I am a storyteller. I am an artist.
Thank you. Okay, I'll just put my camera on here so you're not talking to a screen on your own. I mean, that's fascinating. I've always loved your work, Ronald, and I think that there's something so profound about the history and the embeddedness of where you come from historically, as well as what the work is actually saying. This idea of the transition, the movement across. Do you want to talk about some of the trials and the sort of difficulties you've had around identifying yourself, I suppose, and perhaps putting that into your work somehow. You mentioned the spaceman, the astronaut, and how do you first of all deal with the internalization of this sense of diaspora or being part of the diaspora, and then exploring that subjectivity and putting it out? How if I might just start there.
Yeah. So I think when I first came to South Africa, it was very tough for me because I had the skill set, I had the skills, but I didn't have a narrative. I didn't have something to talk about or to say, and I felt that I wasn't knowledgeable enough to, because I think as an artist, it's not only just your, the skills that you have, but also like what is your diet? And when I say diet, I mean like what do you consume in terms of like film, music, literature, and also the people that you hang around with. So I think that my time when I was in Zen, there was a little bit of that, but it didn't have more growth. And when I came here, I I couldn't sort of like figure out how to place myself because I didn't have some sort of pathway. I'd say, okay, cool, going to this academic school, and then I'm gonna learn X, Y, Z, and then I'm gonna be introduced to this and that and that and that. My first, my ex-girlfriend, was someone who gifted me, I Write What I Like by Steve Biko.
Mm-hmm.
So that's when I started like understanding like what Black consciousness means in South Africa, and then also like understanding how art and music work with each other, how the it's not just about the art, but it's also the struggle music that was made, the jazz music that a whole lot of things. So anyway, for me, I felt that um, I needed to put myself in a position where I can say to myself, this could have been you. It's either this could have been you, or um, how are you addressing these emotions that you have? And it started off with a lot of experimentation, stepping out of my comfort zone, trying different techniques, different aesthetic, different exploration with the work and with my surroundings, um, understanding sound bites. When I mean sound bites, I mean by saying that if I hear like a politician talking nonsense on TV, there's a sound bite in terms of a line or sentence that they say, and that could be a source material, or that could be a title of an artwork, and then I build out from there. Or could be something that somebody wrote, or even something that people say in the street. And then I flip it, and then I make an artwork based on that. The challenge with making work that's very emotive from your soul is that you contradict the status quo of the industry that you're in. So, for example, when you're in the visual arts or in the art world, most of the work out there is created to facilitate the ongoing engagement of this industry. So it's pretty pictures and all that kind of stuff. So when you're making work that's really real, there is that fear of like, okay, cool, if I make this work, will it really resonate with the masses? And there was a time where people would either say my work is dark or my work is deep. And that was, in those stages, it was very tough for me because you know, creatives always aspire affirmation. And when somebody said your work is deep, your work is dark, blah, 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 I didn't understand as to are they affirming me or they're actually, you know, pushing me away with their words. So with over the years, I started understanding the forms of recognition and the platforms that actually the work and the nature of the work was actually necessary and it was being embraced based on the platforms that I started engaging.
So I have a question. I mean, we're looking at this piece now.
I think really if you go at the end,
Okay.
the artwork at the end, because that's the scroll.
All
If you
right.
first show the picture and then we go back to this video.
Oh,
it'll get-
the final, the big piece.
Yes, yes, yes.
Okay, let's just show them what it actually looks like at the end of this is the slide we were talking about.
Yeah.
Okay, so you know, you mentioned a few things as you were talking. You will talk to the work now, but I wanted to just kind of raise the awareness of like of yourself as someone who's had to transition to a different space, and I like this idea of being able to become all aware of all absorbing of the entire experience. And I mentioned this to the students that we spoke to. I've been lecturing in the past that it almost becomes a sense of one mode or one medium will not be able to answer the experiences that you're going through. So it's almost this multimodality that you are employing, much like, you know, having to go to a different space. You have to reconstitute yourself. You have to kind of like do a dance to sort of fit in, you know, like what mold or what spaces can you go through. Walking through Mowbray or Hillbrow is not the same as walking through Sandton, and having to make those adjustments, those code switches. And I'm seeing that in your work. Do you think that is part of a diasporic subjective response? Or is it a mechanism that or kind of naturally falls into being?
It's both of those. You know, sometimes I'm one of those artists that, you know, I get crucified for having my work shift a lot. I get crucified a lot for that. But the thing is that I try to explain it in terms of seasons and periods, as you mentioned. There are times when I didn't have a studio and I had to work in my flat,
Mm-hmm.
and I couldn't, you know, I couldn't paint in oil paint because I didn't want to mess up my flat.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't want to live in a flat where, you know, I'm smelling fumes every day. You know.
Right.
So I had to deal with mediums that are very easy to clean and wash. Like for example, it's either acrylic or ink or charcoal, whatever. So, you know, there are periods like that where you don't have a studio. It affects the way you work.
Mm.
There are periods where maybe, like for example, during COVID hit in 2020, we dealt with in Cape Town. We were dealing with not having art materials at art source, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And what I had to do was now I had to revert to what my mentor Helen Leros used to say. She used to say that during the struggle years in Zimbabwe, they couldn't, because of sanctions, they couldn't get art material into Zimbabwe. So she had to deal with working on newspaper. And during COVID, because there wasn't material and outsource and stuff like that, I had to start working on newspaper. You know. So all of these things, these shifts and whatsoever, they also influence the change of the work.
Mm-hmm.
But also the great thing is that they also bring in an element of richness to the work too.
Mm-hmm.
Do
you want to tell us about? Do you want to? Sorry,
yeah.
do you want to tell us about the work that we see in front of us now, or?
Oh yeah, yeah.
Mm.
So yeah, I'm gonna tell you my honest, you know, because when I made this work, we had to bite our tongue. But I think I'm in a place where I can fully express what the work is about.
Say it. Say it.
So the title of the work is called The Zimbabwean Gaze.
Mm.
So, you know, in academia, there's the black gaze, there's the white gaze and stuff. So I wanted to use a title that would sort of like unite perspectives. So, for example, if you're in front of a mountain, the person who's on the top floor and on the middle floor and on the ground floor, they're seeing the mountain, but they're seeing it in different perspectives. So I felt that what's going on in Zimbabwe is different perspectives to what people are seeing.
Mm.
So I felt that let me make a work in which we can continue the dialogue of what's happening in Zimbabwe, even though people have different perspectives of what they think about Zimbabwe. But let's keep on having these conversations, especially in Southern Africa. And this piece was a piece for Venice. So basically, it's a 10-meter scroll. It's 10 meters, right? And you know, with the scroll traditionally in, you know, during the era of the Roman Empire or even um, during the times of the kings and the
Pharaohs, Egypt.
Saxons and
Yeah.
whatsoever, they you know they communicated with, if there was a decree to say, they would use a scroll or whatsoever, you know. So what I wanted to do, because I always wanted to make a piece that would have influences of this type of nature. So the first thing was that what I usually do is that when I do a project, when there's a theme or whatever, I try to figure out what type of medium can suit the theme first. That's the first thing. The second thing is that the mood, I need to use specific colors to 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 um, to facilitate the mood that the artwork deserves or the title deserves.
Mhm.
So, for example, in this situation, I didn't want to use color. I wanted to use, you know, monochromatic colors, blacks and whites, because I feel like the black and white are very hard edge colors,
Mm.
and the execution of drawing and the brown paper and stuff. And the pose, I had to put the Zimbabwean birds to kind of like bring in an element of heritage, but then also, you know, as you open a scroll, there's these sort of like wooden emblems traditionally, you know.
Mhm.
The red cloth is a symbol of traditional Shona culture. If you want to go to, if you are, for example, you are lost, you're going to a funeral, a red cloth is it distinguishes a funeral. Whereas here in South Africa, usually you see a white tent outside in the street, and you know, in Zimbabwe, it's usually they will have like stuff outside, whatever, but outside the gate is a red cloth that's tied as a symbol that, you know, there's a funeral and stuff like that. So it's a symbol to alert the community, or to, for those people who are lost, or trying to figure out how they can get to the funeral, or to give um, an awareness to the community, like, please respect the space we are mourning, right?
Mm.
So for me, part and parcel of this work was that, like, mourning the situation that's going on in Zimbabwe.
Mm.
And then the elements that are in the work are much more politically driven, but politics that are much more spiritually inclined.
Mm.
So much of the figures that are in the drawing are figures of the normal day-to-day Zimbabwean, but I used silhouettes. And then there's a thin line that runs in between the drawing, and it's a if you squint your eyes, it's a thin line, but basically it's drawings that I intentionally incorporated in the scroll to make it, when you're closer, it looks like a drawing. It looks like drawings that are incorporated with white, but when you move back and you squint your eye, it's like a thin line. So the idea of the thin line is to also embrace the idea of hope, and how hope is very thin in tough and harsh circumstances.
Yeah.
I played around with numbers within that white line. I played around with numbers to bring in an emphasis on the dates in which things were really tough in Zimbabwe.
Yeah.
2008, 2018,
Yeah.
in the 90s and stuff. But the way the work is created is that you really have to be somebody who really understands how to read art to understand what this work is about. There are burnt elements of the work. The burnt elements of the work were an emphasis on corruption and how it destroys economies, how it destroys people's lives. There's a dog there that's busy peeing on the masses. That's how I feel these political leaders are treating us. They're peeing on the masses, taking us for fools. And so there's so much incorporated that I wanted to create a mood. I wanted to create something that when you go there, you have to look and decipher. And the top of the scroll has somebody playing a cello or that bass thing in jazz, and the strings or the chords of this instrument, they run through the middle of the scroll, and then they become faces of people screaming and crying. And then it runs through, and then on the sides there's animals like snakes. I drew people on snakes and grotesque imagery. And the snakes are a reference on. So when I was making this piece, I was listening to Thomas Mafumo. There is a two-part piece that was done by some journalist. It's on SoundCloud. It's called The Mugabe Years. So it narrates his journey as a musician from the time of the 80s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. And one of the songs that he sings or he uses is the song called Nyoka Msango, which means the snake in the bush. So what he explained was that Nyoka Msango is a metaphor to say when the comrades went to war, they went to war not knowing that amongst them there were sellouts. There were people who were about to sell them out to the Rhodesian forces or something like that. So when I use it in this work, I wanted to put reference as the snakes that we are engaging with now are these corrupt politicians that are putting us in this situation. So basically, that's what this work is about.
Thank you. I mean, there's you mentioned a lot of stuff here. I mean, there's first of all the symbolism, obviously the motifs and things that you use. As an excellent draftsperson, I know that you draw so well, but you also do have this ability to take a drawing that you might have beautifully done, and I think we can move to another image here, and you can tear it up. You can make it.
I think if you go to the video,
which video is that one? There was is this a video? No?
This one, yeah.
Oh, okay, hang on, here we go. Wow.
Yeah,
So I see what you're talking about, that thin line, which almost acts like a narrative in itself, weaving its way right through. And I love the music iconography here. And again, you know, draftspersonship, you draw like a dream. So what I was saying is in that there's these symbols, and you know, obviously the difficulty within diasporic subjectivities, or at least exploring or understanding that one doesn't fit in or one is different, one can't articulate that in one foul swoop sentence. We've been exploring this idea of being diasporic in terms of home, nostalgia, and belonging. And I think all your work talks to all three of those things all at the same time. But I think the point I'm trying to make is, or trying to ask you is, so many motifs, so many symbols, so many materials, and what you're asking the viewer to do is to kind of decipher, right?
Yeah.
And I think that you mentioned that you said something about someone needs to look at this work with a trained eye in some ways. So you're saying, if I don't know the stories, if I don't know the information or from whence it comes, I might not be able to experience it fully. And which leads me to my next question, which is that if you had stayed in Zimbabwe and you were trying to make this work, would it be as resonant to you, based on you being at home, or was it because you move across that you're able to kind of access this multiplicity of interpretations and stories and things? Do you mind if I keep going through the work? Maybe.
Yeah.
Like,
So I think
where
it
is
was a
home?
time.
Where is home for you, for instance? How would you articulate that?
I think that the definition of home is always determined by where you are at the moment. Home can be, for me, home is family, my family.
Mm.
When I went to Zim last year, I was very shocked by how things have moved. It's like as if you have a glitch in your head. You're trying to remember old spaces, but those spaces are in ruins now. And you know, I'm of a particular generation. I have memories of the 90s,
Mm.
and those memories of the 90s are gone. I can only reminisce with people of my generation, but it's very difficult to engage with those memories like with the younger generation. So sometimes for some people, home is memories, nostalgia, because they can't escape. For me, I think it's both. It's memory, the engagement with my peers or older people, friends, and also family.
Mm.
Yeah.
Similar
And
experience.
to answer
Yeah.
your question, I think that when I was commissioned to make this work, it was for Venice, the big scroll, and I had to actually question myself as to the next 10 to 20 or 15 years when people start asking the questions of what we did, what am I going to say?
Mm.
And the reason why I used a lot of metaphors, or what one would say as proverbials in a way, visual proverbials, is to sort of like camouflage oneself in the work, because this was a state-sponsored exhibition, and people who are from the state's government do not know how to read art. So hence the training and thing that I mentioned, but also it's like it's also work for academics for the later years to mine. And it was also like it was like me trying to make work that's politically charged from a spiritual perspective, but then allowing space for academics to mine the information and then write about it and spread. So I'm addressing the work from a very abstract perspective that the masses might not understand. But then when the academics hear a phrase like the Zimbabwean days, then they are able to dig deeper and write and engage and then they become the mouthpieces of the work. Whereas I made it in silence.
Yeah. Do you want to tell us about some of the pieces coming up next? I mean, there's this piece here.
This one is called Struggle for Zimbabwe. So it's actually from the book, The Struggle for Zimbabwe.
I see book pages there actually as the substrate on which you worked.
Yeah. So there's so basically this book was written in the 80s about what had happened in Zimbabwe and stuff like that. And when I made this work, I made it in 2016. That was a period when there were a lot of demonstrations and shootings happening in our area, and marching in the streets, demonstrating and stuff. So what I wanted to do was I wanted to flip the work to make it more this idea of using references like from the Bible, from maybe the 30s and 40s when the early camera came out. The camera here is a form of documentation, the media, because I felt that the media wasn't covering a lot in terms of what was going on in Zimbabwe. And then there's that lock watch. The numbers on the lock watch are reversed. But the person in that watch is the current president now. And the dragon is a very biblical, symbolic gesture from Revelations.
Very much so.
About how the dragon was, captured and whatsoever. There's a form of reference of evil, like how evil is we're in a constant fight against evil.
Yeah.
And some of the hands that you see are hands that, so the drawings of the hands on the pages are also like pinpoints and key points within our political history with regards to the Lancaster Conference that happened, when they were trying to.
Okay.
They were trying, yeah. So all of this is just a reflection on the history, but then all of this is also kind of like an emotional engagement with how the youth or the masses in Zimbabwe are feeling about what was going on in that time. This one is rescue. So when I made this body of work, I was looking at the idea of how, for example, by the tip of Africa, a lot of people try to leave Africa in boats to get to Europe, but most of them die on the way. They die trying to migrate by the ocean. And I needed to flip Edward Munch's the screen
Yeah.
to kind of like bring a resonance to like, how, how it's either we're being rescued or not rescued in our pursuits for greener pastures. And that's what this work is about.
So there's the motif of the Ghana go bag or the China bag is something that, I mean, you and I have spoken before, but there's something so ubiquitous about it, and at the same time there's something so chilling and kind of dark about what this pattern really means. I've used it in my work, you used it in yours, and I remember Gerald Machona also used this as well. So maybe again there's this common thread that, there's this device that speaks a certain language across a type of experience. Maybe you would like to talk about that?
Yeah, so in my early years, I worked with this aesthetic a lot, but I'm one of those people where if I work with something, I don't want to be branded for working with it. So I have to find other means and ways to talk about migration without using this. Hence the current work that I have. I departed from this, but it still speaks about migration.
Yes.
So this work was much more of an extension of the bag itself. But if you look carefully at the pattern, there's a point where the pattern breaks, and it's quiet. It's just pink lines. And then there's a point where the pattern flows and it becomes blood or whatsoever. So this work is about sex workers in Spain. So there are people who cross the ocean who make it to Europe, either Italy or Spain. And some of them at that time, I think around 2014, 16, some of them were working in farms. I think they were like either Nigerians or Congolese, whichever. And when those farms closed, those people had nothing to fend themselves with. So they decided to be sex workers in forests or in those areas. Yeah.
Wow.
So when I was looking at the images, they were like discarded tubs, chairs, just weird things in the bush that we used as prompts for sex work. And my inclusion of this bar on the legs is also giving an emphasis of slavery.
Yeah.
How the black body as well is also used as a form of exploitation, in these foreign lands. So it's not only just people trying to fend for themselves when they get there, but then there's also an element of exploitation waiting for them there.
That's right.
They're caught in between being in these foreign lands, hoping that there'll be a break at some point, versus coming back home. So they're stuck in between.
The in-betweenness is something we speak about quite a lot. That sense of, I think it was, W.E.B. Du Bois and Frantz Fanon spoke about that double consciousness of, I need to be somewhere, but I'm not going to get there, and I've left something behind. In much the same way that you said that, and I've also responded to the idea that the Zimbabwe I had is no longer the Zimbabwe anymore, but where am I in between? Am I floating down the Limpopo River? Is there experiences ahead and behind at the same time? So the simultaneous belonging, not belonging in both spaces is quite an interesting aspect of your work. We're going to go through some more, and hopefully we'll have some time. Let me see to get some questions. Yes, we've got about 7 minutes left, and then I would so we can race through some of the examples.
This one. So the
Go back.
previous one is This one is about the borders.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So a lot of people don't know that when Cecil John Rhodes was part of these mining concessions like De Beers and some of these concessions in the Cape Town and Kimberley and Joburg, he immersed in the late 1800s. He made like £1 million, and that £1 million is what he used to establish Rhodesia, northern and southern Rhodesia. So he is part and parcel of the problem that we have now, being an architect of this legacy of borders that separate us and our fellow countrymen, our neighbors and stuff.
And it's interesting you say that, because earlier on you were talking about Africa and the perception, that maybe the West generally, majority Americans believing that Africa is a country in some ways, and you don't have to go far. You watch videos on TikTok where they ask, what name 3 countries in Africa, and some people are saying things like Afghanistan and all the rest of it. So the construction of these borders and the sense of being an African, and at the same time, as Achille Mbembe and Steve Biko have kind of put forward that, how can an African be a foreigner on the continent? And the borders as abstract constructs, which are then maintained by state and government and nationhood or nationalism, are miscreants of this particular history, and where we sit today. And you reference that even here in this next piece. Yeah.
So sometimes in my work I tend to, in music there's a terminology where they say sample. So you take something old and change it into your own, and so for me I flipped this artist from China, his work into something that's slightly similar to, and currently, so there's this neo-colonial enterprise that's happening in Africa, where there's an infiltration of Chinese imperialists with a desire to expand and appropriate and I think in a conquest mission slowly take over Africa. And our leaders, again, are yet to blame. And this type of new colonialism is very dangerous, because if you can't pay the Chinese back when you borrow money from them, they strategically choose key points of land, and then they make it their own. And there's cases in Zimbabwe where they're also taking ancestral land, like people who've been there for centuries, traditionally their land has been taken away due to minerals and natural resources and stuff, which is something that I don't think under the Mugabe era, that I don't think that would have flown well with him, so this work is kind of like a flip on Cape to Cairo, the illustration of Cecil John Rhodes as a colonialist, and now I reappropriated it and more from a Chinese perspective, but using the made in China bag as a reference terminology for
So once again, Africa finds itself in the center of a global resources war at the end of it all. We've got the West on one hand, and you have the East on the other. Currently, I just watched an interesting documentary which spoke about the rise of the Chinese economy and then the negotiations that are happening within the Western states, and Africa again is in the center of it all. It will be interesting to talk more about that later, but let's go on.
This one is position of power. It's same. It's within the same aspect of the Cecil Jones as well. But in this situation, I was looking more towards the idea of how, if you look at it carefully, there are two bodies, but it looks like one body.
Yes.
And it's a statue, but in the heart of the statue is a black woman.
Yeah.
And for me, I think what I wanted to emphasize with this work was like trying to give a response to Fees Must Fall, Rods Must Fall, sorry, and use the exploitation of the black body in terms of labor.
No, I mean,
sorry. The labor and also the crushing of one's will. And we like our society, the backbone of the society is the black woman, and I think that for the longest, colonialism or slavery, like I think the huge impact has always been on the black woman, even in like our current time now, where whenever an economy gets hit hard financially, the first person to get hit the hardest is a black woman, because she is at the receiving end, and I feel like it has been like that for a very long time. Hence, I had to sort of like play around with this idea of power structures.
Yeah. This comes across in your other work. I don't know if you mind me skipping a couple slides, but there's more. There's another set of pieces. There's maybe this one. I was going to say perhaps that also refers to what you're talking about here.
Yeah, but this one, it's much more complex. So the fence is like the border.
Yes.
But if you look at it carefully, those three bodies, once they transform into fish, it's the bags, it's the made in China bags.
Yes, yes.
But the lower bodies, like the legs, from the waist going down to the legs, those are the colors of the Zimbabwean bag.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. I see.
And the idea of the fish and stuff, I was looking at how, when I was making this body of work, I was also looking at the idea of how animals migrate without borders.
Right. Exactly. I think, the idea of our national borders having an impact on the natural environment as well. Our unnatural borders are imposing themselves on natural movement. I showed my students a pre-colonial map of the different groupings of African peoples. And, once you superimpose the borders on top of those groupings, you realize that whole families, whole related groups of people were separated by this imaginary line. Yes, I just wanted to sort of say that. Your next piece here. I'm liking what's happening here. There's a transition in the work itself. It's become completely different, and I see when you're saying you're shifting in your media all the time.
Yeah. So this was the work I said I did during COVID. I was working on newspaper and stuff. This series is called Blackness.
Okay.
So I was looking at what being black meant during that time, the time of the George Floyd,
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
racism around the world, and
Sure.
just being stuck during lockdown and all these things, coming up. And what I wanted to do from a very aesthetic perspective was to work around with layers of paint, draw, and sort of like make imagery that would make sense to the narrative and also the elements next to each other.
Nice.
Yeah, and also like this thing of like who decides to define what blackness means. It is quite recognizable as to experience, but its blackness is very vast. It's like you can talk and talk for hours about blackness, but you can't. No one can actually say that I'm an expert in means. So I felt that it was something that I needed to highlight at that time.
It also speaks to that's whole idea of African and nation identity. So you've got Zimbabwean, you've got Nigerian. We don't have to go too far to understand that stereotypes according to where you come from in the continent exist based on your blackness or the tone of your skin and things like that. One might deem it sort of Afrophobia in some ways, where you go, Nigerians are dark, tall, and they sell drugs. The stereotypes that come with these things, and there's a resonance between the George Floyd incidents and that same sort of conversation around blackness on the continent as well.
If you look at the previous painting, the same as this one, yeah. If you look below, there's the symbol of health at the bottom, and then on top there's this weird face that has a mask. So those are some of the subtle symbols I use to sort of like reference a time and moment.
Yes. Yeah.
The clenched fist and all those things, questioning this idea of like all these things that are going on in Africa or Europe or China and surrounding black.
Before we open the floor for questions, I want to just talk about maybe two last works. Well, I can flip through these quickly, and then maybe you can answer them later so that people can see. There's a full range of multi-modes that you use. There's installation here. There's sculptural elements. There's again this shift from materials to other forms. And what I really find exciting is this kind of thing where all of a sudden the materiality starts to question what the object is, what it's doing, how can it be read. And
that is actually Wallen's work.
I know that's Warren's. Well, my point. No.
Yeah.
Okay, so you're on the front there. Sorry, but Warren again is also
but
he's also Zimbabwean.
Sort of like, yes, I needed to show how the curation of the space looked like for the pavilion, for those people who didn't get to see our pavilion.
Yeah. Warren is another Zimbabwean artist who is also speaking to the same sort of ideas. And then we come to the end here. And I think I'd like to perhaps say at this point, then thank you And perhaps if you're willing to sort of engage with our audience, and I'm asking if there are any of my students who would be willing to engage or ask a question. Rachel, I think, shall I stop presenting? We might go back to one particular one eventually, but I'll stop sharing at this point, and we can come back to
Okay.
us.
Yeah.
Has there been anything in the chat, let's say?
Yes. Andrea had a question. Andrea, I'm not sure if you're still here. I think you are. If you would like to speak to that question in person, sometimes that's really nice.
Okay. I'll do that. Just thank you so much. Wonderful, wonderful work. But now, I mean, you can see me. So my question really was, well, how would you respond? Because it's really a question about your audience for the work. And how would you respond if someone like me, I would supposedly identify as a kind of white Anglo-African woman, and what if I read all sorts of other things into your work apart from the stuff that you're trying to bring across? How would you respond to those kinds of interpretations?
I completely understand it. There's never a moment where I think that the work that I make has to be in one dimension. It resonates to different audiences in a different way. I learned in my practice that I can't, like, for example, when I make work and I sell the work and it's out there, I no longer have power over it. It has a life of its own. In that sense, from a physical perspective, I no longer, I was the custodian, I'm no longer the custodian. In the same breath, when somebody, because what we're talking about is based on consuming. So there are people who consume as in purchasing, and then there are people who consume in based on looking at the work and how they resonate with it. And for me, I don't have power over how they, because the emotions that I had in the studio and the emotions that I had when I finished the work and the emotions that I have when I see the work are different from the other person, because I don't know what they were feeling when they woke up to come and see the work at my exhibition or even in a talk like this. But it's like that's the freedom of art. It cannot just be like, one definition. There's multi definitions of it. And I gladly accept other definitions.
Okay, thank you. So does it affect what you want to say? I shouldn't hold up. It's just a yeah.
It only affects what I say when the critical element of the reason why I made the artwork is being questioned.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you. Wonderful work.
So,
yeah, thanks. Okay.
Thank you.
Andrea, thank you for that question. Wonderful thoughts there. I this idea of the consumption and the creation of work is interesting to me. Partly when maybe you can get to this after you answer Zama's question, but the idea of the commodification of diasporic subjectivity is something we didn't get into. But Zama, please go ahead.
Hi. Yeah, my question kind of largely related to what we're talking about now, because in the news clip in the interview that played earlier in the slides, you said the scariest thing for an artist is to make work and have no one listening. I found that very interesting because I want to relate that statement specifically to the context of your more international exhibitions, because your work does allude to documentation and storytelling of socio-political issues and historical events within a Zimbabwean and South African context, right?
Yeah.
And those like two realities as a diasporic identity. So I wanted to know, like, when you do exhibit to, let's say, like an American audience, when where there's a chance for that context you're speaking to, when it's in a space where the understanding may not fully be pieced together, or where you're exhibiting in these countries that may not understand the gravity or the substance behind what you're addressing. How do you, I guess, engage with that fear of an outside audience, outside of an African context and an academic context, just not hearing what you're trying to articulate, I guess?
Now that's a very good question. So I think I can answer this for myself and for anyone who finds themselves in that position. I think the most important thing is that you have been given a platform. There's nothing more greater. And when you have been given a platform to exhibit or whatsoever, I think that there is an expectation that you have to express yourself based on whatever you are dealing with or what you stand for or whatsoever. And I think that you cannot half step when you're in a situation like that. You have to honor your work and honor yourself and trust in yourself so much that even if it's not received in a more positive way or whichever way, because as I said, you cannot control how the work is consumed. You should have that satisfaction that I've done the best that I could to express and execute and do what I needed to do. The international audience is very hungry to hear stories, different type of stories. It's unfortunate that we live in a world where because you're a Black artist, you have to make a certain type of work for you to be heard. And for me, that's nonsense. I believe that each and every work or story is valid, irregardless of what the trends are and whatsoever. So I think, just to answer that question, I think just honor your work, make your work be more impactful, say what you want to say, mean what you want to mean, and it will show. Like, as long as your execution is you did it at a master level and you expressed yourself the best way you can, it will always resonate with the audience 100%.
Thank you for that answer. I wanted to ask a little bit about, so I mentioned this commodification of diasporic subjectivity, and you started to touch on the idea of the message, the means by which you make the message, the places in which you show the work. South Africa has been fraught with a lot of, issues around the foreign national, and we have this conversation. It's very much present. How do you think your work contributes to the solutions? And what is the solution? I'm not asking for a finite sort of like, is there a solution to I mean, I say to my third years the other day, I think that it's imperative that people be able to see or step outside of themselves to understand, in some ways, to build a vocabulary of understanding, of being in that in-between space. One solution I had for them was that it should be mandatory for everyone to travel across the continent for at least 1 year and experience something different. Maybe while you're thinking, Rachel's got her hand up. Maybe you can, Rachel?
Yes, that's such an interesting question you raised, Vulindela, and I wanted to maybe contribute to that a bit, because the question of solutions is a very interesting thing that often comes up when we deal with these very difficult topics. there's, we're exploring them, but then what? And that often comes up from students and also from within ourselves. But I think that we sometimes, for wanting to find a political solution or a kind of economic solution to these questions, we miss what art is doing in the social space. Because I think it is part of this dialogue between people, where people are understanding each other's experience. And I know that's not enough, but it is a thing. It is something that is being done by art in this space. Is that, like, when I look at your work, even though there will be aspects of it that I miss, or misinterpret, I get a visceral sense of bodies, and what they are going through. I can see these bodies interrupted by the ground that they are, on. I can see them going through these kind of very difficult processes. I can see this unstable ground underneath them. And I think art, not just this art, but a lot of other work that I've seen, has the power to show me somebody else's experience in a way that other things don't. So yeah, I think it's part of that public discourse, public dialogue, which helps people to understand each other's realities in a world where that's not happening enough. So that's my kind of 2 cents on the kind of solution orientated questions, because yeah, my mind also goes there with my own work. But then I had a question about your process, going to that figure ground relationship. I wondered, your compositions are so interesting. Could you talk us through your approach to composition, if you think of it in that way, or is it something that just really comes intuitively?
So let me answer Voli first, then I'll get back to you. So for me, art is a bit tricky because art is not like, it's not like a gun. It's not like you can hold, it's not a weapon that you can hold somebody for ransom or, unless it's money. But but the, the thing about the issue that we have as people in the creative industry is that sometimes, the issue of immigration and migration, and it's a very on the ground situation, and it's 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 on the ground, it's systematic, it's everywhere. But sometimes our industry is secluded from the masses. Um, so what I personally do is, for me myself, is that I I engage content from Twitter or podcasts from people that I wouldn't necessarily like, who might come across as being xenophobic, who are South African. The reason I do that is because I cannot be somebody who is only biased to one narrative. I need to listen to the other side for it to make sense for me. And when I reach that conclusion where I've consumed so much, then I reflect on my work and I ask myself the very questions surrounding, illegal foreigners, the negative things that some foreign nationals are doing and whatsoever. And then I try to find a way to negotiate within my work to tell the truth. And sometimes I find myself agreeing a lot with the South Africans, just saying, like, what you're saying is true, what you're saying is true. It's just that I think that because South Africans voice out their issues a lot, it's very seldom that you hear foreign nationals being given a platform to say, I agree, I agree. So I think that's where it starts, where we accept to say, like, South Africans are feeling a certain type of way. We need to embrace their emotions and feelings. And then when we get to that point, then we can say, okay, cool. What solutions can we do? Can I be part of an NGO that facilitates this? Can I do? What is my space when it comes to, you know, Operation Dudula as a documented foreign national? What should I do? How should I hold space? How, you know, like the solution will slowly reveal itself. It's not a solution where I could say I have the answers, but within the process, because you know, most of this information or information that comes out and comes into the minds and works of artists, it comes in through an element of it's a process-based element. The same way as how you make art in the studio, it's also process-based. So all of it combined works with each other simultaneously. So I think that the solution would also happen in that way. But sometimes it also takes a lot of bravery to step out and say like, cool, this is what we feel we can do. This is like, you know, and majority of it, most of the times, has something to do with creating alliances, you know, working with the people that you don't like or people that don't like you, but for a common goal to make things better, you know. Currently, I'm working on a body of work that's very challenging for me. Um, I don't know as to how the broader public will embrace it, but I have
Do you
to.
want to give us a quick taster of what it might be about?
It's this work here.
Uh-huh. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
So it's um, so it's documentation that I used to use as a refugee.
Oh, wow. Oh, fantastic. I like that. Okay.
Yeah. So I mean the document is expired. I went back
Yes.
home.
Yeah. Yeah.
I have a passport now, just like any normal human being. But the work itself, I'm sort of like exploring the 15 years of what that work, what it means to have that document, emotions, frustrations, maybe abandonment issues or longing to be home or a lot of things, frustrations, happiness, joy, relationships, you know, institutional issues, xenophobia, whatever. Um, and what I've decided to do is that I decided to bring in um, writers. So I have a writer who's writing a Zimbabwean side of the narrative. I have another writer who's writing the South African side of it to facilitate this body of work and the growth of it and stuff like that.
Wow.
So this now puts me in a very vulnerable space where the issue of migration is not only just an exterior analysis as before, but now it's interior now. Now it's from a specific personal space.
Yes.
So maybe the solutions could come from there, where you know when people start getting to understand that, oh, so this is what happened. This is what This is you start explaining because I think we as Africans we don't talk.
Mm-hmm.
We don't talk. So I used to have situations back in the day where some people would be like, "Why don't you go home in December? Why don't you go home?" Like, and I didn't have the right words to articulate because for me, it was my own personal story of why I wasn't going home.
Yeah.
But now, because of this body of work, now I can completely explain, like, no, I couldn't go because of X, Y, Z. And then it will sort of like resonate. And then it'll be like an educational element to the many people. With Rachel's question,
Sure.
I studied extensively, visual art and art history and stuff, and I like to break composition. That's what I like to do. So I'd like to create unusual forms of composition where sometimes people say, oh, this artwork doesn't look finished or this and that. I try to break my work into various forms of composition so that I find more freedom to express myself the best way I can. Because sometimes the traditional methods can be very.
Wow, Ronald, you left us on a high point because I want to find out more about this other work that you're doing. I'm like, how are you bringing that in now, right at the end? But I appreciate you as a fellow artist, and also as my friend. We go back some time. You're always very wise when you speak about your work, and very honest. You have a way of delivering which I really enjoy just listening to. And maybe in the future we might get you to Quebec in person. I'm hoping that could be the case. And wow, it's just, I hope this has been as exciting for everybody as it has been for me. I enjoyed the work. I enjoyed getting insights into some of the modes of thinking around being a migrant in South Africa, and how that affects your work, how you articulate it, how you deal with this idea of diasporic subjectivity. It's not necessarily like a content and that you're saying, I'm working as a diasporic subject. You're working as an artist who's experienced a certain thing. And it just so happens to be encased within your experiences as someone who's migrated. So I'm very, very grateful for the time that you've afforded us. I'm very grateful for everyone who's joined us today. And to my third years, I hope this has been just as thrilling as the lecture series that we've just finished. To those people who came from outside the institution, I did say welcome. I'm hoping that some people from Stellenbosch Academy and maybe outside in the faculty. Andrea, I'm very grateful for you for being here. Rachel, I think if you'd like to sort of put your camera on, and I could say thank you to you for being our moderator and I suppose producer is what they call it in the background. And were you muted?
It's only been a massive pleasure. Yeah, to get to see the work and work a little bit with the work. It's been amazing. So yeah, thank you very much, and may this be one of many artist engagements that we have.
Yeah, I think we're going to go forward. I mean, we have the Visiting Artist Talk program coming up. Ronald, again, thank you so much. To everybody else, thank you. I hope to see you soon.
Sure,
And
thank you.
All right. Goodbye, everybody, and thank you very much for joining us.
Sure.